I'd like to thank everyone for attending this presentation hosted by the Society of Women Geographers. I am Daina Cuevaleria. I will be presenting on Can Democratization Protect the Environment, State and Civil Society Engagement, and Water Pollution Governance in Lake Titicaca. First, I'd like to give you a brief overview of my presentation. For decades now, since the 1990s, rural and urban environmental groups and communities in Puno, Peru have struggled to mitigate water pollution in Lake Titicaca, ensuing from the region's rapidly expanding and unplanned urban centers. In 2019, however, the implementation of sewage water treatment plants for 10 towns bordering Lake Titicaca marked an unprecedented environmental governance outcome. I point out that this outcome is linked to joint political efforts between state and civil society that exemplify a collaborative shift. I utilize concepts such as the dimensions of democracy and synergy to account for this collaborative shift, but also to characterize the environmental democratization process underway in Puno. Characterizing this process will be critical for understanding whether this process can address urgent and complex environmental problems like water pollution, and whether it can yield sustainable environmental governance outcomes. Before I delve into the major components of my research project, I'd like to provide you with some background information about Lake Titicaca and the sewage water treatment plant project. Here's a map of Lake Titicaca. On the yellow portion of the map, you have the Puno region of Peru, and each of the green circles stands for each of the urban centers that will receive a sewage water treatment plant, for a total of 10. As many of you might already know, Lake Titicaca is the largest lake in Latin America, straddling Peru and Bolivia. It is about 3,800 meters above sea level, and it has approximately half the volume of water as Lake Ontario. There are numerous urban centers and rural communities that surround it. And particularly, this is particularly true of the Peruvian side compared to the Bolivian side, which is not as heavily populated. And the main source of water pollution in Lake Titicaca has been identified as sewage and solid waste originating in urban centers. This is by no means the only kind of contamination that the lake receives. There are also substantial amounts of mining activity around the lake, particularly north of the lake. It is important to keep in mind that this lake only has one river that drains it, and that is the Desaguadero River, which, as you can see, is in the southern part of the lake where the arrow is marking it. So if you look down towards the bottom of the image, you'll see where it says Desaguadero River, there's an arrow there. And that's the flow of that river. I'd also like to note, I also like to note that this makes the lake more prone to retaining contamination, since there is only one river that drains it. Regarding the project, 6 sewage water treatment plants will be fully built, whereas 4 will receive only maintenance and operation. So I also would like to show you this infographic created by the central government to explain to you a few more details about the sewage water treatment plant project, also known in Peru as PETAR Titicaca. What I like about this infographic is that you can clearly see which of the 10 cities will be receiving sewage water treatment plants. The government is starting with 6, as I said, and these 6 will need to be built from the ground up for the cities of Ayaviri, Juliaca, Puno, Ilave, Juli, and Mo. The other 4 will receive maintenance and operation for their existing sewage water treatment plants or their oxidation rates. According to the government, these sewage water treatment plants will treat up to 90% of the sewage water's contaminants. On the right-hand side of the infographic, you can see the infrastructure that will be built for the sewage water treatment plants. I'd also like to highlight some important details about the sewage water treatment plant project. It is approximately a $214 million investment by central government. It is also a public-private investment, which is a first for the region of Puno. It will be fully subsidized for the next 30 years. This means that there will not be increase in water tariffs, and this decision to fully subsidize for the next 30 years was made by the central government to deter opposition to the implementation of the project. FIPASA, a Mexican corporate group, was selected to design, construct, and carry out the maintenance and operation of sewage water treatment plants. The technology that will be applied is known as the activated sludge process. Although I don't specialize in the technical aspects of this project, I know that these sewage water treatment plants will first remove all solid waste and then utilize aeration, which is a form of oxygenation, and microbes to oxidize the organic pollutants in the sewage water. This project is divided into 3 phases. The first phase is the implementation, which took place between 2014 and 2019. The implementation phase ended in 2019, which, since that is the year when the contract with FIPASA was signed. Then comes the construction phase, and finally the maintenance and operation phase. Most importantly, and for the purposes of my case study, the sewage water treatment plant project incorporates a social component into its design. Now, here are 2 images of the Bay of Puno. On the left-hand side, you can see eutrophication of the lake, the green portions on the water, and on the right-hand side image, you have a more panoramic view of the city of Puno, so you can get a sense of the city's density. Next is an image of the Guara River, which, as you can see, brings with it incredible amounts of sewage originating from Juliaca. Along with sewage from the city of Juliaca, which flows into Lake Titicaca as it passes through the Coata community. And here I want to also show you that, I skipped this one, that the image here is that of the Puno's oxidation plant, which was built in 1972, but by now it has completely collapsed as it is no longer able to filter the vast amounts of sewage originating from the city of Puno. So this is what many of the oxidation plants that currently exist in all of these 10 sites look like. So having provided you with this background information, I'd like now to move on to discussing the barriers and constraints in the Puno political and social landscape to provide context and situate my study. It may also help bring out the significance of this collaborative shift and approach linked to the sewage water treatment plant implementation process. To begin with, this is not an exhaustive list, but it is a list of what I believe to be the most challenging aspects of the Puno political and social landscape affecting the implementation of sewage water treatment plants. I point out here that municipalities are burdened with territorial organizational problems, often marked by disputes over land ownership. This means that in many locations, it has not been determined whether a plot of land belongs or does not belong to the municipality as state land. It is also the case that public servants lack stable and long-term jobs within state institutions, leading to high turnover rates, which become problematic for the implementation of any kind of project. The Puno region also lacks experience with the public-private partnership model. This has required intensive work with Puno mayors to get them to be proficient with the legal and bureaucratic aspects of this model. There's also the general problem that state institutions, including the central government, fail to keep projects on schedule. There are project delays or projects end up stalling indefinitely. This may then lead to protests and demonstrations from civil society. Then, of course, it follows that we have high levels of distrust of central government and local government. It is also important to point out that there's division and power struggles at the local and community level. For example, Puno, Juliaca, and Coata have had major differences and difficulties coordinating with each other to address the implementation of sewage water treatment plants. So, moreover, I think it's important to consider that there is a history of opposition and resistance to development projects initiated by the state or by the private sector in the Puno region. There's also a prevalence for antagonistic state civil society relations, which central state actors were very much aware of prior to commencing the project. And this weighs heavily against the implementation of the project. Lastly, it is also the case that informality pervades the loosely connected civil society organizations in Puno, and this limits their capacity to more effectively engage with the state. Now I'd like to highlight the purpose and some of the contributions of my research for theory and policy. Based on my exposure to the environmental geography literature, I believe there's a need to advance understanding of the integration of top-down state and bottom-up civil society approaches to water pollution governance. More specifically, this means providing greater understanding of how democratic political practices and synergistic engagements of Puno civil society, environmental actors, and state institutions are linked to the advancement of environmental democratization to generate desired environmental governance outcomes. This provides an opportunity to contribute to the democracy environment debate in political ecology that asks whether democratization can protect the environment. On a policy level, my research may generate public policy that is attuned to actual political, institutional, and social landscapes for the effective and long-term sustainable management of water infrastructure development projects. It may also generate transferable insights. The findings from this research project may enable addressing water pollution governance struggles in places like Lake Nicaragua, Lake Atitlan, and the Bolivian side of Lake Titicaca that may share similar political, institutional, and social landscapes to that of the Puno region. This is particularly important given the ongoing intensification of water pollution in the world's biodiverse lakes, which are primarily found in the tropics. Now that I have laid out my research aims, we can move on to the theory and framework that structures my case study. I have drawn from the literature on democratization and synergy to account for the collaborative shift linked to the sewage water treatment plant project and to answer the question regarding whether democratization can protect the environment. I want to emphasize some of the main concepts and ideas within this literature. I like to begin with a quote from Fisher 2017, who adequately captures in a broad sense what democratization and synergy are about. He states that, quote, governance today is increasingly contingent on the character of state-society relationships, end of quote, instead of self-organized collective action. Synergy studies specifically stressed the importance of civil society engagement with government at multiple levels to forge a relationship of interdependence and mutual empowerment through joint collaborative interactions critical to the collective formulation and effective implementation of development schemes. In this literature, democratization is conceptualized as a relational process involving struggle and nonlinear gradual change over successive cycles of engagement between civil society and the state, marking the transition to substantive democratic consolidation. So let me unpack that a little bit, since I realize that that is a lot for one sentence. The important point here is that democratization is a social process, and social processes do not tend to display linear trajectories. The reason for this is that they involve cycles of engagement and struggle that are not continuous. when these processes are advanced, they bring about gradual change. The idea that democratization leads to the consolidation of substantive democracy has to do with the creation of democratic spaces and their proliferation. So related to the concept of democratization is also the concept of synergy. And this concept was put forth by Eleanor Ostrom. She takes synergy to be a collaborative interaction that involves inputs from the state and inputs from civil society that are not substitutable, but must be complementary. This then leads to the production of higher quality goods and services. In the case of sewage water treatment plants, I take this to mean their effective and long-term sustainable management. Additionally, I also look to the three dimensions of democracy that have been highlighted in the political theory literature. I take what the political theory literature calls democratic spaces and their proliferation to be democratic political practices, namely deliberative participation, representation, and accountability. Each of these focus on different types of practices that would be captured in a democratic process. With respect to deliberative participation, scholars have mentioned that it involves renegotiation and the reshaping of political space while acquiring political capabilities, as well as the determination of citizens' real interest for appropriate decision-making, and that such participation creates spaces of public communication, allowing for greater inclusiveness. Pertaining representation, the goal is to build connection and trust. This may prove difficult to achieve, given that building connection and trust needs to pay attention to a relationship of difference between constituents and representatives for responsive decision-making. In other words, attention needs to be paid to the differences between state actors and civil society actors, and even differences among civil society actors. And in Puno, the difference between actors can be considerable. Accountability is also another key democratic political practice that has to do with the institutional capacity of the state to respond to citizen voice. It is not just about negative sanctions, but also about proactive approaches that involve citizens in government activities. There are numerous activities that may count as practices of accountability. We will see what these may be when we reach this section on the research findings. And before I present the research findings, I'd like to briefly discuss the methods I used to conduct this study. I carried out semi-structured interviews, oral histories, and archival research. And this latter one involved perusing government documents and documents given to me by civil society environmental actors, looking over photography, video footage, and even news coverage on the sewage water treatment plant implementation. Aside from asking my participants questions about their democratic political practices and their synergistic efforts during interviews, I also asked them to discuss how they perceive the sewage water treatment plant implementation efforts to change over time between 2014 to 2019. I asked them to reflect on barriers to civil society and state engagement to bring about the sewage treatment plant implementation project, as well as their motivations for such engagement. My research was divided into two phases. In the first phase, fieldwork was conducted in Lima with state actors from Proinversión and the Ministry of Housing and Sanitation. To be specific and to clarify the difference between the Ministry of Housing and Sanitation and Proinversión, Proinversión is the state institution tasked with selecting and financing projects that are deemed of national importance. Then the Ministry of Housing and Sanitation is able to actually implement this project. The second phase involved fieldwork in the Puno region, specifically with civil society environmental actors and local municipal authorities. The civil society environmental actors I interviewed were primarily leaders of environmental and social organizations and neighborhood representatives. The project's duration was 14 months, taking place between 2021 and 2022. So now on to the primary findings on democratic political practices and synergy. This section on findings is divided into 3 parts, one for each of the 3 dimensions of democracy. So I start with deliberative participation between 2014 and 2019. 300 public meetings, forums, conferences, and workshops were hosted by central state actors and municipalities to discuss the sewage water treatment plant implementation. And this took place in all of the 10 sites in the Puno region. There were presentations of the sewage water treatment plant implementation by state actors in which they offered question and answer sessions. Working groups and roundtables were also established at the insistence of the Coata community, the most affected community in all of the Puno region due to this sewage contamination. The government ended up creating a separate working group just for this district to address other issues aside from water pollution, like health and agriculture. There were also field trips that took place during this time period in which civil society environmental leaders, which from now on I will be referring to as dirigentes, which is the term used in Peru, were invited from the Puno region to learn about the sewage water treatment plants that operate in Lima, the capital city. This was very important since most people in the Puno region, and even many dirigentes, had never seen a sewage water treatment plant before, nor knew how they worked. A number of debates also took place in the local media involving state actors and some dirigentes. I have also highlighted in red what I find problematic about deliberative participation during this time period, which relate to 3 specific aspects of deliberative participation. The first is that I did not find evidence of Puno's civil society environmental actors having agenda-setting power in meetings with state actors. By agenda-setting power, I mean specifically civil society environmental actors determining what topics are discussed during the meetings, and not just state actors making this determination. Second, civil society environmental actors were not directly involved in any way in the technical elaboration of sewage water treatment plants. Although Puno University professors and engineers were invited to give evaluations of the project, it is unclear to what extent these evaluations ultimately influenced the project design. Third, these meetings did not take place continuously. There were many periods of inactivity and little communication about the project from the state, particularly between 2015 and 2017, when the private companies bidding for the project were carrying out their design studies. And also due to Proinversión having to set up the public bidding process twice after the company that won in the first bidding had its contract canceled due to a corruption scandal. But as you can see in the column to the right, what can be extracted from these participation practices is that there has been knowledge and information exchange between state and civil society. And this is a form of synergy. Knowledge and information exchange between state and civil society permitted advancing with respect to territorial organization titling and carrying out expropriations to establish and protect the sewage water treatment plant construction locations. As I mentioned earlier, municipalities are quite behind with respect to territorial organization. And for this project, it was essential for them to work with civil society environmental actors to resolve disputes with communities and individuals claiming ownership of lands. The image at the bottom right was taken by Maritza Mendoza Canasa in 2018. She was one of the social workers who put together these meetings and made sure everyone that needed to be there was invited. This meeting took place in the city of Huancané, and you can see a Proinversión state actor there presenting on sewage water treatment. In fact, you can barely see it, but I can tell it's the logo, the Proinversión logo on the screen there. The second key democratic political practice that I'm going to look at is representation. By formal representation, I mean the representation that corresponds to elected political authorities. And by non-formal representation, I am referring to civil society environmental actors and dirigentes. So the key idea underlying representation is the cultivation of trust in networks. With respect to this project, efforts were made by the state to cultivate trust in networks, specifically with dirigentes. These efforts took the form of temporal alliances to maintain contact and build networks with dirigentes from urban and rural areas, and as well as with university students. Another way to cultivate trust and networks involved facilitating the transmission of civil society environmental actors' demands to higher level government institutions. So more or less, the chain of transmission for their demands would be from dirigentes to mayors to congressional representatives and or directly to state actors from Proinversión and the Ministry of Housing and Sanitation. Moreover, the sewage water treatment plant project was incorporated into the local level electoral agenda of some political candidates. However, it is important to point out that although there has been a vertical cultivation of trust and networks, that which takes place between state actors and civil society environmental actors, there has been much less of this cultivation horizontally. In other words, between civil society environmental actors between themselves. And this has a lot to do with power struggles at the local level. Dirigentes are highly competitive and have not been able to unify groups to articulate horizontally. Hence, local alliances remain unstable. It should also be pointed out that there have been problems with the identification of dirigentes due to the informal nature of the organizations they represent. This means that some of them are not always invited to these meetings. In any case, from these practices of representation, it is possible to identify some synergy. In cultivating trust in networks, civil society environmental actors and dirigentes were more disposed to disseminating information of the sewage water treatment plant project to the communities that they represent in order to generate support for the project. Civil society environmental actors also aided state actors with the identification of other civil society environmental actors or other dirigentes that were disseminating false information about the project. This then highlights the importance of building alliances between state actors and dirigentes. And now on to the last democratic political practice that I explored in this research, which is accountability. As I mentioned earlier, accountability refers to the capacity of the state to respond to civil society demands. There are many activities that can help improve state accountability. The ones that I focus on here have to do with monitoring, transparency, and access to information, and a legal system of sanctions. The central government carried out monitoring of the project development and implementation primarily through the support work that they did with Puno mayors, whether that be in terms of assisting them with territorial organization and land titling, or with the legal and bureaucratic aspects of the public-private model. There was also transparency and access to information. Proinversión created a website that provided the project information and from which you could download materials like brochures and pamphlets, including the project contract. The Ministry of Housing and Sanitation also set up a regional branch in the city of Puno to facilitate information and to address questions, problems, or complaints from civil society regarding the project. Proinversión and the Ministry of Housing and Sanitation also made it clear that there is a legal system of sanctions that they can turn to in case the private firm fails to fulfill the contract to build and operate the sewage water treatment plants. And I also add here that a few dirigentes were individually monitoring the progress of the project implementation by contacting state actors that they knew personally to keep them up to date with the project. However, what I find most problematic about accountability in relation to other political practices I just discussed has to do specifically with monitoring. I found it problematic that no monitoring committees had been formed at any point during phase 1, so that civil society environmental actors would be ready to begin monitoring once the sewage water treatment plant project enters phase 2, which is the construction phase. Monitoring committees monitoring committees had also not been proposed or even contemplated during phase one. I want to point out that monitoring committees are critical for projects like this one, since there are not enough government actors or government inspectors to be able to determine how the construction project is unfolding. Problems that emerge with the construction phase can be prevented through monitoring groups and reducing the likelihood that certain sectors in civil society that are affected by this construction do not turn against the project. Lastly, I'd like to conclude with some final thoughts on my case study. My case study has led me to some insights and to consider implications for theory and for environmental governance outcomes. First, my case study has allowed me to show the importance of analyzing each of the dimensions of democracy. For each dimension, we see expansion of democratic political practices and also synergistic engagements. This is an important finding since for most civil society environmental actors in Puno, this is their first experience engaging with the state in a collaborative manner. So what follows from my findings is that I take democratization to have advanced as a muted process that we could further characterize as being drawn out, uneven, nonlinear, and uncertain, and in which the three dimensions of democracy, and for which in the three dimensions of democracy, accountability appears to be the weakest link so far. From the findings, I also draw a critical insight regarding the democracy and environment debate. Namely that when it comes to the question, can democracy, specifically democratization, protect the environment? I find that my case study does not yield a yes or no answer. That is, it does not yield a binary answer. What this means is that if democratization is a process, then that puts the focus on potential. That is, the potential for more expansion of democratic practices and increase in synergy to move the process forward away from its mutedness, especially as the project enters the construction phase. As pertains to policy, my case study suggests that there's a need to invest more in political governance, in political institutions, but also in civil society organizing. This has been referred to as capacity building for strengthening water governance. Therefore, the question remains open as to whether democratization can address urgent and complex environmental crises, but also whether democratization and more broad can yield sustainable sewage water treatment plants, and more broadly, whether democratization can lead to sustainable environmental governance outcomes. Thank you very much for your time. And I'd like to acknowledge the following organizations and institutions for supporting my fieldwork. The Evelyn L. Pruitt National Fellowship for Dissertation Research by the Society of Women Geographers, the Conference for Latin American Geography, the CLAG Field Study Work specifically, the Barnhill Willington Research Fund from my Department of Geography at the University of Kentucky, and the Fulbright Hays Doctoral Dissertation Research, which funded part of this research by the US Department of Education. And here are my references, and I'm very happy to share those with you if you'd like. Thank you again.